एकं अक्षरं हृदि निरन्तरं भासते स्वयं लिख्यते कथम्। हृदयकुहर मध्ये केवलं ब्रह्ममात्रम् यहम् इति साक्षात् आत्मरूपेण भाति। हृदि विषमनसा स्वं चिन्वता मज्जता वा पवनचलनरोधा आत्मनिष्ठो भवत्वम्। देहं मृण्मयवत् जडात्मकम् अहं बुद्धिर्न तस्यास्त्यतो नाहं तत्तत भावशुक्तिसमये सिद्धात्मसद्भावः। कोऽहम् आवयुतः कुतो मरतिय दृष्टात्मनिष्टात्मना सोऽहं स्फूर्तितया अरुणाचलशिवः पूर्णो विभाति स्वयं। सोऽहं स्फूर्तितया अरुणाचलशिवः पूर्णो विभाति स्वयं। Namo Ramana. In this, the Thursday Satsang from Ramana Maharshi Center for Learning, as is our usual practice, we will be reading verses from Guru Vachaka Kovai, the work of Muruganar Swamigal. We will be reading 2 verses selected for us. Each verse reading will be followed by a short meditation on its meaning, and that shall be followed by a 10-minute practice of Atma Vicharam, self-inquiry. After these 2 segments of verse reading, meditation on meaning, and the practice of Atma Vicharam are completed, there will be summing up remarks by Shri Venkatesh Ji, and that shall be followed by the offering of Sri Ramana Stotram. The chanting will be by Vaibhav Ji and Prapnama, and the floral offering shall be by Manjunath Ji from right here. We begin this evening's satsang by going to the first verse selected for us, verse number 90 from Guruvachaka Kovai. We find this segment we find this verse in the segment investigation into truth that immediately follows the prefatory verses. There are two further segments. The investigation into truth is followed by meditation on the truth, and the last segment, of course, is the verses on experience or anubhava, experience of the truth. We go to verse number 90. This we find under the subsegment Vivarta Siddhanta, the doctrine of illusory appearance. Vivarta Siddhanta, the doctrine of illusory appearance, the truth behind the manifestation of the world. Verse number 90. The reality that is consciousness is indeed the self. The reality that is consciousness is indeed the self. The world is objectified consciousness, a distortion within consciousness. If a rope truly existed as consciousness, would it seek someone else, a separate being, to become a snake? There is a note. Muruganar is saying here, somewhat elliptically, that a rope only becomes a snake when someone sees it, whereas consciousness doesn't need the external witness to validate itself, since it is self-validating. Muruganar is saying here, somewhat in a roundabout way, that a rope only becomes a snake when someone other than this sees it, whereas consciousness doesn't need an external witness to validate itself, since it is self-validating. The reality that is consciousness is indeed the self, says the first line. The reality, by reality, Bhagavan means the unchanging substrate, which is the support of all changing factors like the waking, the dream, the deep sleep, and all the contents of the waking, all the contents of dream. All these form the manifested world, the waking world or the dream world. They all have an unchanging consciousness as the substrate. That is called as the reality. So Bhagavan gives us 3 pointers to the substrate. The substrate has been called the reality because it is unchanging. That which is unreal is discontinuous, changing, transient, whereas the reality is unchanging. The reality that is consciousness. So the second pointer that Bhagavan gives about the substrate is that the substrate is consciousness itself. It is arivu. It is the light of the knowledge itself. It is consciousness. Is indeed the self, the Atman. The reality that is consciousness is indeed the Atman. The Atman and Anatman. The Atman being the subject of all subjects and Anatman being the objectified consciousness, says the next sentence. So the first sentence is that the reality that is consciousness, it is Chit. is the Atman. It is the subject of all subjects. It is not an object to be perceived. It is not an object to be seen. It is the subject of all subjects, the self. The world is objectified consciousness. So what is the world? The waking world or dream world is objectified consciousness. The same consciousness alone, which is the reality, alone is seeing itself as objectified world, as objectified consciousness. The world is objectified consciousness, a distortion within consciousness. So where does this distortion take place? As in Dakshinamurti Stotram it is said that this is all a swapna happening within us. That realization comes that the whole objectified consciousness has only to be within the self-attentive, limitless consciousness. The self-attentive, self-luminous consciousness has no limits, has no boundaries. So whatever is objectified and has limits, in one sense, has to be within the limitless. So it is a distortion. The world view or objectified view is a distortion that is happening within the consciousness. If a rope truly existed as consciousness, would it seek someone else, a separate being, to become a snake? Now, the popular illustration of Advaita, is the snake and the rope. In many of the listeners would get tired by listening to this reference to snake and rope by many a speaker, but it is a very significant pointer. The significance lies in that if you see the snake, then you don't see the rope, and if you see the rope, you don't see the snake. Now that kind of example is very rare, that if you are seeing the Atman, then you don't see the Anatman at all. That means the Atma Drishti is of such nature that it can be only true if no Anatman arises. Bhagavan tells in Ulladu Narpade, Uruvam Tanayin, Ulagu Param Matru Am. Uruvam Tan Andrel, Uvatrin Uruvatte, Kan Urudal Yavan, Yavan, Kan Alar Kachi Undo, Kan Adutan Andamila Kandame. Now, this is not just quoted to just like that. It is a very significant verse which refers to the illustration of the snake and the rope. Now, the verse goes like this: if oneself is a name and a form, then necessarily the world and God assume a name and form. As Bhagavan says, so far as body identification is there, there is a lot of meaning in worship of God with name and form. In fact, it is impossible to worship God without name and form, he says, so far as you are strongly identified with a name and a form. But Uruvam Tan Andre, if one inquires into oneself, who am I? And eliminates one after another the body contents, the breath contents, the mind contents, the intellect contents, the ajnana contents, all are dismantled by consciousness. Tanittu irukkum arive nan. When one understands that oneself is the nameless and formless self, then Uvatrin Uruvatte Kannurudal Yavan, who is left, or how can one see the form of world or form of God? If one has dismantled all the conditionings and has found that oneself is the self-luminous self, how can there be a seeing of the world, or how can there be a seeing of the form of God. கண்ணதுதான் அந்தமிலா கண்ணாமே. That self is the limitless I which sees nothing else apart from itself. So therefore it is clear that what is the rope? The rope is the self, the Atman, the consciousness, the reality. In Bhagavan's teachings, he gives the leeway of experiencing the Spurana, the I. In many places, he calls that as the self, where the self-attentive consciousness, the I is there, not even as substrate, but as independent being, as independent self, self-luminous self. There, that is the experience of the rope. Now, whatever else you see, what else can it be apart from a distortion of this vision? And does it need a witness apart from that reality to come and see it as the snake? So in the illustration, as in any other illustration, there is a limitation. So the illustration of the snake versus the rope is a very key illustration because it brings out the Advaitic possibility. If you see the self, then you don't see the world and God as form. If you are seeing world and God as name and form, then you are obviously not seeing the self. If you are seeing the rope, you are not seeing the snake. You cannot see the snake vanishes. Whereas if you are perceiving the snake, you should know that you have missed out on seeing the rope. But what is reality? The rope, the reality is the self-attentive consciousness which is independent of everything. Then what else can be the snake? The snake can only be a distortion within that limitless consciousness. It doesn't need anything apart. So what does it mean? It means that the seer nature, the jiva who perceives, the witness who witnesses the world is also the self only. That is where the who am I brings its completion. That since the witness or the jiva cannot be anything apart from the self, the enquiry, who am I, is a direct path to come to the self. Instead of going the roundabout way of seeing all the various ornaments as gold, go directly to that which is blocking this view of gold, the ego, and remove it. Remove the Chitjada Granthi so that the perception of the reality, the consciousness, the Atman is directly there. And of course, Muruganar is saying here that the witness as well as the world witnessed, how can it be anything other than a distorted vision in the complete self? So, if I am considering myself to be an ego who has aggregated many body parts, who has aggregated many experiences, who has aggregated many thoughts, many likes and dislikes, and I call that as me, and over and above that, I have a set of inclinations which all raise and condition me, then that also, that sum total of the limited ego, how can it be anything different from the rope? It is only the rope which is seen distortedly as the perceiver as well as the perceived. So instead of going into the multiplicity of the perceived, go into the truth of the perceiver, there one directly is enabled to identify oneself, to merge oneself in the Atman, in the reality, in that consciousness. With Bhagavan's immense grace, let us inquire into this perceiver, who cannot be apart from that rope, that Atman. And by the inquiry, who am I? Let us directly practice taking the I to its source and merging it there. Revatima, you can set the time for us. Namo Ramana. We go ahead with the reading of the second verse selected for us, verse number 1103. 1103. We find this verse in the last segment, that is experience of the truth. The subsegment is formlessness. Formlessness under experience of the truth. Verse number 1103. Having experienced sorrow by wandering extensively in all directions in the world. Having experienced sorrow by wandering extensively in all directions in the world, it will be foolish to continue to remain fascinated by it, the world. It will be foolish to continue to remain fascinated by it, the world. Merge with the feet of Supreme Shiva, the Mauna, which is eternal Shivam, that destroys the sorrowful movements of the mind which are engendered by the ego. Having experienced sorrow by wandering extensively in all directions in the world, it will be foolish to continue to remain fascinated by it, the world. Merge with the feet of Supreme Shiva, the Mauna. Supreme Shiva is here, the Mauna, which is the eternal Shivam, which is the eternal Shivam that destroys the sorrowful movements of the mind which are engendered by the ego. Having experienced sorrow by wandering extensively in all directions in the world. This can be done either with the sensory body or by manana and contemplating on the vicharas given by the great ones in the question and answer from Swami Natanananda, that is the spiritual instructions, the last prose work. Bhagavan says, the scriptures say that wherever there is a body, there is sorrow. Wherever there is body, there is sorrow. And this is the experience of all, he says. To Natanananda Swami, quite in the early part of that work, that is called as Upadesha Manjari in Tamil, or spiritual instructions, it is called, which is published in the 1930s. That is the last prose work. Who am I and self-enquiry. In fact, self-enquiry is the first book. Who am I? And then Upadesha Manjari. These three form the prose work teachings of Bhagavan. In that, one of the first few questions itself, what is sorrow? Bhagavan says, the Vedas, the scriptures say that wherever there is a body, there is a sorrow. There is sorrow. So, how can we wander in the world? We can wander in the world only having a body. So wherever you take this body and go, the world will be there. Then there will be sorrow also. Because the body is, whether it is physical body, whether it is the subtle body or the causal body, the body is nothing but conditionings. A conditioned way of consciousness. Whenever consciousness is conditioned, it has its purposes, but it is always accompanied by sorrow, because there is a limited way in which the life takes its form, and there is bound to be sorrow wherever there is a body, says Bhagavan. So, natural corollary is that in whichever part you may wander in the world, then this sorrowful body must be there, and therefore, in whichever direction you go, you have to understand that this cannot be unalloyed happiness. This, whatever pleasure we may find, is only mixed with sorrow. So therefore it is sorrow only. Bhagavan says, while discussing the pleasure of the world, Bhagavan says, the pleasure can be understood as Priya, Moda and Pramoda. And Priya is, he says, when you are walking in a marketplace with the mind going here and there, rambling all over the place, as in the second part, the movements of the mind are going on, but you see a lovely mango, and that one thought, the thought of that which you like, it puts aside all these ramblings. And Bhagavan says, the putting aside of those thoughts gives you happiness, not the mango itself. Your like for the mango, suppose your stomach is full and you are struggling to walk, then even if the same mango is there in front, the same liking will not come and the thoughts will not be put aside. The eye will see the mango and drowsily move somewhere else. Therefore, the mango does not have the capacity to give that pleasure, but it is the putting aside of the thoughts which block the Atmic happiness. Says Bhagavan that the liking for the mango puts aside all the ramblings, and that gives you a sense of pleasure. But now you need to possess that. You need to possess the mango. Otherwise, there is this feeling of discontent, and then that is moda, he says. You have the mango in hand, so that displaces the discontent of not having it. Again, the happiness is the putting aside of the discontent, the thought. Then finally, you are surrounded by people, you cannot consume it, you keep it. It is not enough for everyone. Keep it aside, and later you have it. The moment you have it, the discontent of not having taken that mango, that is put aside. But in all the three cases, the happiness is not due to the action, but is due to the removal of the thoughts and the revelation of the Atmic happiness unconsciously, says Bhagavan. So, really speaking, what we sense as pleasure from the world also is only from the Atma, it's not from the, so it's a deception that we feel that there is happiness from that object. So that is where the sorrow lies, the ignorance with which we run after worldly things. Therefore, Bhagavan says, once you have done enough manana on this, by actually going to those places and discovering sorrow for yourself, or doing manana, that there cannot be real happiness in roaming around here or there, then in that manana, all fascination for roaming around in the world goes. Then he says, merge with the feet of Supreme Shiva, the mauna, the self-attention, the stillness, which is eternal Shivam. Shivam means happiness. It is eternal happiness. It is unalloyed bliss. Eternal is a term introduced there, but it is beyond time. Just to show it is beyond time, it is called eternal happiness. The mauna is beyond time and place. So that is the real happiness. And Shiva is usually taken to be a destroyer. And that is taken to have negative connotations. But here the true meaning of destroyer, which Bhagavan refers to in talks also, is brought out. What does he destroy? The eternal Shivam, the Maunam, destroys sorrowful movements of the mind. The mind running, oh, take this thought, I will give you happiness. Go there, I will give you happiness. And who is behind this? Behind the movements of the mind, engendered by the ego. All these movements are completely destroyed by that stillness. In the same work, Spiritual Instructions, Bhagavan says to Swami Natanananda, being still stilling the ego or being in mauna, it is not laziness, it is not indolence. It is mulu muyarchi, he says. It is complete effort to be still. And Maya is sorrow. Maya, which cannot be destroyed by any other action, is completely destroyed by this action of stillness. That is what is referred to here as merge with the feet of Supreme Shiva, the Mauna, which is eternal Shivam. So the destroying nature of Shiva is not negative, it is absolutely positive, because what it destroys is the movements of the mind, which is all engendered by the ego. And along with the movements, the ego also stands destroyed, and one merges with the identification with that mauna. One realizes that one's true nature is mauna. It is not the ego which rises out of mauna, or the multiplicity of the world, which is nothing but maya or sorrow, which is crossed by merging in the feet of Supreme Shiva, the eternal happiness, the mauna, which removes, destroys all mental movements engendered by the ego. That is the practice we are going to do with Bhagavan's immense grace for the next 10 minutes, stilling the ego, destroying the movements of the mind, so that there is a merger with the mauna, the feet of Supreme Shiva. Let us sit in practice for 10 minutes. Devatima, you can help us out again. Thank you. Namo Ramana. I request Venkatesh ji to give us the summing up remarks. Namo Ramana, sir.
Namo Ramana, Arunachala. Gurur Brahma, Gurur Vishnu, Gurur Devo Maheshwaraha, Gurur Sakshat Parabrahma, Tasmai Shri Gurave. When I was doing manana on this verse number 90, I realized this part of the truth behind manifestation of the world. Now, the one thing we understand, the truth will always be the truth. You know, the truth, what can you talk about the truth? The truth is the truth. So what can you do is, we can talk about it is, we'll talk about the untrue. What is untrue? When you talk about the untrue, then you will realize what is the true. Like for example, to know the good, there must be bad. Actually, bad, what does it do? It glorifies the good. But bad has to be there. Then only the good can be seen. So let's do a little manana on this and say, who is a truthful person? Who speaks the truth? We understand this very clearly, that a truthful person is a person who speaks the truth. Now, how do you realize something is untrue? How do you realize something being said is untrue? If you are in truth, that's when you realize that something which is being said is untrue. So similarly, if in this verse what they say is that the reality that is consciousness is indeed the self. That's a statement which says that is the truth. That is the consciousness is the self. So what happens is we have to now say, oh, this is untrue, this is not the self, this is not the self. That's the whole process that we have to actually go through. Now what we are trying to say is self is real and non-self is therefore unreal or untrue. So for example, the ornaments, when you look at the ornaments, Nankumar also spoke about the gold ornaments. Now the gold is true, but the ornaments are all projections of gold. Just let's think about it for a minute. The ornaments are just projections. Imagine if you have in your locker one gold biscuit of 5 grams and a necklace of 5 grams. What will you think about? Will you think about that biscuit of 5 grams? No, you will not think, oh, let it be. It is not, it has got no project, it has no projection, it has no, it is just in the biscuit form. But let's look at this necklace. This necklace now, what has happened? It has become, the design was very old design. Now let's change the design. Let's melt it and make it a new projection. So what happens? Your mind goes into those projections. Now you're not, this is a very simplistic example, but the truth is what? The truth is the gold. And everything is the projections. So similarly, in the ocean is water, right? What are the projections? The waves, the beautiful big waves. We go to the ocean. Why do you go to the ocean? We go to see the waves that are coming up and coming down. But what are those? Just projections of the water. So once we understand the reality, that's what Bhagavan is trying to say here, that the reality that is consciousness is indeed the self. The world is objectified consciousness. That means objectification. What has happened? The gold has objectified itself to a necklace. Water has objectified into a wave. So what we see, because we see ourselves also objectified as is body, mind, intellect, then what do we see outside? We also go on seeing the objectified objects. It's like the necklace, or we see the waves. Imagine if the ocean, how many of us go to a lake? No, the lake, nothing is happening in the lake. It's still. How many of you would like to go to a lake? Very few. Few to nobody would like to go to a lake because nothing is happening there. But an ocean, why people like it? Because there are waves that are coming up and they become little ripples and come near our feet. We like it. So this is basically an objectification that's happening. So, like for example, if this example typically comes up when you go to Rishikesh, is the Ganga. if you go to the Ganga and see what happens in the Ganga, if you're outside Ganga and watching Ganga, for example, what do you see? You see Ganga flowing and you'll find a lot of objects in that. You will see, especially if there is a lot of rains and all, you will see it very dirty, muddy, a lot of objects flowing. Okay. But does the holiness of the Ganga go? What is the inherent quality of the Ganga? The inherent quality of the Ganga is the holiness. By all these objectification that is happening, by all these objects that are being seen, when you're outside Ganga, see, you must understand this very clearly. Once you're outside Ganga and watching, then you're seeing the objects. You are not seeing the holiness of Ganga, but when the Kumbh Mela happens, lakhs and lakhs of people will go and take a dip in that same dirty Ganga. Why? Because they believe that Ganga is holy. At an intrinsic level, Ganga is holy. So that is what most important. So it is how you look at things that matters. So that is from a spiritual perspective. If you ask, everybody says just be. Just be, like the fly on the wall. Just be. But what we think ourselves we are not complete. God, the great one said, Tattvamasi, you are that. You are whole and complete. You are Purnamadha, Purnavidam. You lack nothing. But in our mind we say, no, how can we not lack? Look at that fellow, he's got something. He is looking more handsome, or that lady is looking so beautiful, or that fellow's got so much more money, or that fellow's got 2 houses, I've got 1 house. So what happens is objectification happens. And objectification happens because of the mind. Mind, it projects outside. It just goes and it's part of the consciousness. See, we must understand this. All the gold which becomes ornaments is just objectification of gold itself. It's only gold. Like I give that particular example, if you have the most beautiful necklace which was worn by any of the film actresses, but you take it to a goldsmith, what will he say? He will not worry about the design at all. He will put it on the weighing scale and he will say, oh, it has got 15 grams of gold. He will just say that. He will not give you 1 paisa extra for the design of the necklace. He will give you only what's in it. In it is gold. So important thing that Bhagavan is trying to tell us also here is that you have to understand what's your true worth. Your true worth is the self. But what happens is we do not know this and we think we are incomplete. We want to be able to go and seek something by which we will become complete. We want to seek property, we want to seek money, we want to fame, we want to seek all these, but these are all temporary. These are all like labels on this body. Because what happens when the Atma leaves this body, all those names and forms, everything all vanish. Now Abdul Kalam, he was Bharat Ratna, and he had all the names, and he was the president of the country, and blah blah blah. So many labels he had. Now when the Atman leaves that body, what happens? Everything vanishes. So what is important? We need to understand what is the truth. That's what is being talked about in this verse, where he's saying that if a rope existed as consciousness, would it seek someone else, a separate thing? So one thing we finally need to understand is that to glorify the good, what has to be there? The bad has to be there. And to glorify the rope, what has to be there? The snake has to be there. If the snake is not there, then how do you glorify the rope? See, in this verse, that's what is being talked about. It's talked about the rope and the snake. We all understand this, that the rope is the reality, snake is just a projection in our minds. And because if we really go and see what it is, we realize that's the truth. So important thing we need to understand as devotees of Bhagavan, that's why we do self-inquiry, understand who we really are. Once we understand who we really are, then we are with the self. When we are in the self, we are in that mauna, we are in that silence within. When we are in the silence within, the world is also silent. The world is silent, you are in perfect bliss. Om Namo Bhagavate Sri Ramanaya. Namo Ramana.
Namo Ramana. May I request Vaibhavji and Pratnama to do the chanting?
Yes. Namo Ramana. भारद्वाज विश्वनाथ विरचितं श्रीरमणाष्टोत्तर शतनामावलिः अपार सच्चित् सुखवारिराशे यस्योर्मिमात्रं भुवनं समस्तं गुहाहितं तं रमणं कबीरं चिन्ताविहीनं हृदि चिन्तयामि। ॐ महासेन महोंशेन जाताय नमः। ॐ श्रीरमणाय नमः। ॐ गुरवे नमः। ॐ अखंड संविदाकाराय नमः। ॐ महौजसे नमः। ॐ कारणोद्भवाय नमः। ॐ जगद्धितावताराय नमः। ॐ श्रीभूमिनाथस्थलोस्थिताय नमः। ॐ पराशरकुलोत्तंसाय नमः। ॐ सुन्दराय तपःफलाय नमः। ॐ कमनीयसुचारित्राय नमः। ॐ सहायाम्बा सहायवते नमः। ॐ शोणाचलमहोलीनमानसाय नमः। ॐ स्वर्णहस्तकाय नमः। ॐ श्रीमद्वादशान्तमहास्थले लब्धविद्योदयाय नमः। ॐ महाशक्तिनिपातेन प्रबुद्धाय नमः। ॐ परमार्थविदे नमः। ॐ तीव्राय नमः। ॐ पितृपदान्वेषिणे नमः। ॐ इन्दुमौळिना पितृमते नमः। ॐ पितुरादेशतः शोणशैलं प्राप्ताय नमः। ॐ तपोमयाय नमः। ॐ उदासीनाय नमः। ॐ महायोगिने नमः। ॐ महोत्साहाय नमः। ॐ कुशाग्रधिये नमः। ॐ शान्तसङ्कल्पसंरम्भाय नमः। ॐ सुसन्दृशे नमः। ॐ सवित्रे नमः। ॐ स्थिराय नमः। ॐ तपक्षपितसर्वाङ्गाय नमः। ॐ फुल्लाम्बुजविलोचनाय नमः। ॐ चन्द्रिकासितहासश्रीमण्डिताननमण्डलाय नमः। ॐ चूतवाट्यां समासीनाय नमः। ॐ चूर्णिताखिलविभ्रमाय नमः। ॐ वेदवेदान्ततत्त्वज्ञाय नमः। ॐ चिन्मुद्रिणे नमः। ॐ त्रिगुणातीताय नमः। ॐ विरूपाक्षगुहावासाय नमः। ॐ विराजतचलाकृतये नमः। ॐ उद्दीप्तनयनाय नमः। ॐ पूर्णाय नमः। ॐ रचिताचलताण्डवाय नमः। नमः। ॐ अभयप्रदाय नमः। ॐ दक्षिणस्य निभाय नमः। ॐ धीराय नमः। ॐ दक्षिणाभिमुखाय नमः। ॐ स्वराजे नमः। ॐ महर्षये नमः। ॐ भगवते नमः। ॐ ईड्याय नमः। ॐ धूमविद्याविशारदाय नमः। ॐ विमलाय नमः। ॐ दीर्घदर्शिने नमः। ॐ आप्ताय नमः। ॐ ऋजुमार्गप्रदर्शकाय नमः। ॐ समदृशे नमः। ॐ सत्यदृशे नमः। ॐ सत्याय नमः। ॐ प्रशान्ताय नमः। ॐ अमितविक्रमाय नमः। ॐ सुकुमाराय नमः। ॐ सदानन्दाय नमः। ॐ मृदुभाषिणे नमः। ॐ दयार्णवाय नमः। ॐ श्रीशोणाचलहृद्बोधस्कन्दाश्रमनिकेतनाय नमः। ॐ सद्दर्शनोपदेष्ट्रे नमः। ॐ सद्भक्तवृन्दपरिवृताय नमः। ॐ गणेशमुनिवृन्देन सेवितामृतसरोरुहाय नमः। ॐ गीतोपदेशसाराद्रिग्रन्थसञ्चिन्नसंशयाय नमः। ॐ वर्णाश्रममतातीताय नमः। ॐ रसज्ञाय नमः। ॐ सौम्याय नमः। ॐ आत्मवते नमः। ॐ सर्वावनिमतस्थानाम् आराध्याय नमः। ॐ सर्वसद्गुणिने नमः। ॐ आत्मारामाय नमः। ॐ महाभागाय नमः। ॐ मातृमुक्तिविधायकाय नमः। ॐ विनताय नमः। ॐ विनुताय नमः। ॐ विप्राय नमः। ॐ मुनीन्द्राय नमः। ॐ पावकोज्ज्वलाय नमः। ॐ दर्शनादगसंहारिणे नमः। ॐ मौनेन्द्रस्वात्मबोधकाय नमः। ॐ मृच्छान्तिकरसान्निध्याय नमः। ॐ स्मरणाद्बन्धमोचकाय नमः। ॐ अन्तस्तिमिरचण्डांशवे नमः। ॐ संसारार्णवतारकाय नमः। ॐ शोणादृशस्तुतिभ्रष्टे नमः। ॐ हार्दविद्याप्रकाशकाय नमः। ॐ अविच्युतनिजप्रज्ञाय नमः। ॐ नैसर्गिकमहातपसे नमः। ॐ कमण्डलुधराय नमः। ॐ शुभ्रकौपीनवसनाय नमः। ॐ गुहाय नमः। ॐ दण्डपाणये नमः। ॐ कृपापूर्णाय नमः। ॐ भवरोगविषग्वराय नमः। ॐ स्कन्दाय नमः। ॐ देवतमाय नमः। ॐ अमर्त्याय नमः। ॐ सेनाने नमः। ॐ पुरुषोत्तमाय नमः। ॐ श्रीरमण भगवते नमः। श्रीरमणाष्टोत्तरशतनाम पूजां समर्पयामि। यस्थानोररुणाचलस्य पदयोः स्मृत्याजनिं प्राप्यत दिव्यानुग्रहसुप्रवाहविवशः सारात्म्यभावं गतः वृन्निष्ठस्वगभीरनित्यतपसा लोकान् पुनास्येकराट् तस्मै श्रीरमणाय ते नम इदं लोकोत्तरज्योतिषे। ॐ नमो भगवते श्रीरमणाय।
नमो 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 रमण सदाशिव प्रभावरण नमो महर्षि नमो महर्षि दर्शन सुख मंगल मुख सकल जीव हित सम्मुख ब्रह्म संगिये सदा तुष्ट सदा हृष्ट सदा शिवानंद पुष्ट परम महर्षि ಬ್ರಹ್ಮನಿಷ್ಠ ಸಮದರ್ಶಿ ನಮ್ಮ ಮನವದೊಂದು ಕಾಡು ನೀನರಿತಿಹೆ ಅದರ ಜಾಡು ಹಿತವನರಿತು ನೀಡುತ್ತ ಕೊರೆಯ ತಣಿಸಲೈ ಬೇಡಲೆಂದು ಬಂದ ನಾವು ನೋಡಿಯೇ ತಣಿವೆವಯ್ಯ ಮೋಡಿಗಾರನೇ ಹಿತವನುಡಿದು ಪೊರೆ ನಮ್ಮನು ಬ್ರಹ್ಮ ಸಂಘಿಯೇ ನಮೋ 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 ರಮಣ ಸದಾಶಿವ ಪ್ರಭಾವರಣ ನಮೋ महर्षि नमो महर्षि। बोलो भगवान श्री रमण महर्षि की जय।
ನಮೋ ರಮಣ ಅಕ್ಕ, ಎಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ನಮೋ ರಮಣ.